This is Market Pathways, your premium guide to global medical device regulation, reimbursement, and policy. Become a part of the global Medtech community at mystrategist.com.
Hello, and welcome to the Market Pathways podcast. I'm David Fillmore, editor of Market Pathways, a publication offering analysis and insights on regulatory reimbursement and policy in medical devices and diagnostics. So we say devices and diagnostics, or Medtech, as umbrella terms, but the reality is it's, of course, an extremely diverse space of technologies, applications, and markets. An important example of a segment that shares some important features and policy priorities with the broader device sector, but also has very particular issues of its own, is medical imaging. Being a piece of capital equipment used over the long term by hospitals raises a certain set of considerations, as does the diagnostic or even routine screening application of the technology. To find out what the medical imaging perspective is in the policy sphere right now, I spoke to Patrick Hope. He's been executive director of the Medical Imaging and Technology Alliance since 2015. MIDA, which represents imaging equipment and radiopharmaceutical companies, is an important voice for MedTech in Washington, D.C. For instance, it joined AdMed and MDMA at the table for FDA user fee negotiations that just finally wrapped up with an agreement last month. Patrick and I talked about that, the perspective of the imaging industry after 2 years in the pandemic, and some particular MIDA priorities, including the need to have more regulatory scrutiny on firms that offer third-party servicing of imaging equipment, and where he thinks attention is needed on device cybersecurity issues. Patrick also happens to be an elected member of the Virginia General Assembly, where he has served since 2010. So he brings a real 360-degree perspective on the policymaking process. Here is my discussion with Patrick Hope. Enjoy. Hey, Patrick. Thanks for joining. Yeah.
Good to see you.
Yeah. Good to see you too. I appreciate you coming on and talking.
Absolutely. Look forward to it.
Yeah. So you've been executive director, I think, of the Medical Imaging and Technology Alliance, or MIDA, for about 7 years, I think, or so. Is that about right? Yeah.
Yep. Almost.
Yeah. I mean, time goes fast. I'm sure past few years, things have really zipped. But just want to very briefly start with tell the listeners about MIDA's mission, its role in policy advocacy development in Washington, just kind of as a place setting for our conversation today.
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad to. MIDA stands for the Medical Imaging Technology Alliance, and we are a division of NEMA, which is the National Electrical and Manufacturers Association. And MIDA, as a division, focuses on representing the medical imaging, radiopharmaceutical, and other medical product innovations. And we focus primarily on advocacy, but people who know NEMA, they know NEMA as a standards development organization. And so that's a part of MIDA, that we develop standards for all of our modalities: ultrasound, MRI, X-ray, and CT, those things that we're very active in the standard space. But on advocacy, of course, it's interface with the FDA and CMS, our regulators, on a reimbursement to help our members. But we also have a very robust legislative front on state and federal matters as well. And there's also a global component, because our members are global in focus. And so we make our products, of course, here in the United States, but we sell them and make them elsewhere. And when you think about standards, we really try to focus on developing a national standard here in the United States and seeing if we can harmonize that standard globally. It's good for business when everyone knows exactly what the rules of the road are from one country to the other. And so it's about harmonizing guidelines and standards, and that global component plays right into that role. Right.
No, that makes sense. And, obviously, there's so many, it's become, the globalness of the industry is, ever evolving, of course. And particularly, obviously over the past 2 years, we've obviously going through this, the pandemic, and just so many things turned over from what they had been in some ways. But I'm curious actually to get your reflection, just to start off, of how that experience maybe impacted how you or how MIDA, kind of goes about its operations in terms of advocating, engaging with policymakers. I say that particularly, just medical technology has been sort of at the center of the conversation in a way that it maybe even hasn't before, this experience, just because of the focus on health and the public health issues. So, just kind of, how's that, maybe reflect a little on, how's that affected how you engage with policymakers, regulators, or, in terms of change your approach or change your outlook in terms of that, or who's informed with what, et cetera?
When you think about all that we've been through over the last 2 years, my gosh, I mean, many of our companies where the rest of the world was closing up and shutting down, our companies were ramping up to work 24/7. Many of our companies converted what they were doing into making ventilators. They formed partnerships with different companies in order to do that, because that was the focus of that time, to make sure that people could survive and be in survival mode. And now that we've had some time to reflect on all of that, now that the business seems to be back to usual. A lot of people were of course staying isolated. They weren't going out to getting treatment. They weren't going out for their annual screenings and exams and things like that, which I think causes a real level of concern, because in our business, when it comes to diagnosis, early diagnosis is the difference maker between stage 4 cancer and stage 1 cancer. And so trying to get those things back into existence where people can feel comfortable going back into the hospital or the physician's office to take care of those routine annual, or more frequently sometimes, exams that can be life-saving. And I think we've started to turn that corner, but I also think that there's a lot of pent-up demand that still needs to remind people to get out there and see your physician, see your doctor, take care of that annual exam. Don't put off that screening, because it can be life-saving for you. And I think also looking back, this is a good opportunity, of course, to look about lessons learned when it comes to COVID. What was our stockpile? Certainly ventilators comes to mind, PPE comes to mind. But during the pandemic, things like ultrasound, portable ultrasound especially, but CT were also ways that we could diagnose COVID and to determine whether or not people were improving while in the hospital. And so making sure that we have these devices spread out throughout the world, the third world and everywhere else, they had access to these medical devices. So taking a look at the stockpile, making sure that those priority things are in the right places throughout the globe in case this ever happens again, or God forbid, a flare-up were to occur, or something that would pierce the vaccinations that we already have. That those things have to be in place in case it happens again. So there's a lot of reflection of where we've gone, but I have to give a lot of credit to our industry in really stepping up. And you think about the other way, I mean, it's almost like a firefighter, that when there's a fire, people are running out of the building, the firefighters are going into the building. You think about in the hospitals, who was managing and servicing the equipment? We had our employees from our companies were still going into the hospitals to make sure that the equipment was operating. And while everyone else was isolating and all the COVID patients were going to the hospitals, so were a lot of our members going in, their employees going in, to making sure that their product devices were operating in tip-top shape.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I was, in terms of screening, and sort of getting patients back, I don't know how much of a policy element there is there. It's just really more a matter of communication. What's the dynamic there?
Yeah, it really is, because I think the policies are good when we talk about lung cancer screening and prostate cancer screening, mammography and colonoscopy. Those are really good where people can get access to the care that they need. If they have insurance, those are free of charge, and the copays are waived. But it's getting people back into feeling comfortable, feeling safe, and going to their local hospital, their physician practice, to make sure that they can get that procedure done. We started what we called a Back to Care campaign, where we had letters to the editors and op-eds. We were working with radiology practices and other primary care physicians to really encourage people to get back into the hospital, because that screening can save your life. It can be the most important thing that you do, is to not miss that annual exam, and encouraging patients to do that. And what we've seen in the data, boy, early on, we saw a lot of these annual screenings really plummet early on, but we've seen the data has slowly crept back into a positive category where we think people are getting back to that care. But it's interesting to see if the incidence of cancer diagnosis and what the prognosis is higher now post-COVID than it was pre-COVID. And that could be something that can be not only detrimental of a human aspect to families and loved ones, but also financially, because it's much cheaper to treat these cancers at an early stage than it is at a later stage. And of course, the outcomes are so much better. So it'd be interesting to see what the data shows from pre to post COVID.
Yeah, it gets at the real meat of what, imaging, a lot of what imaging and screening gets to, obviously. Yeah, exactly. All right, so why don't we dig down into more, particular areas of policy? I mean, from a timely standpoint, something that's happened pretty recently that I know MIDA was very, closely involved in is on the FDA user fee. There were just obviously negotiations going on for the past more than a year with, FDA, MIDA, and the other, device trade groups. And finally, just the past few weeks here, we really have an agreement that's being kind of getting its public airing. So and that just obviously industry is going to be paying some more fees over the past 5 years. FDA has some different commitments and some new kind of accountability measures. Why is this a good deal for industry? And sort of what's your reflection on that?
Yeah, it really is a good deal for industry. And of course, when you look at all the user fees, the drug user fees and things like that, medical device user fee is not even close to what user fees are in those areas. But it is an increase, and it's a recognition of that. But user fees are very necessary. And from our perspective, when we get a product and we want to take it to market, and it has to go through a 510K process, that's where most of our products go through. We want to make sure that we're getting an approval as quickly as we possibly can. Of course, balancing the need for patient safety and the public health issue, but also balancing that with getting that product into the physician and ultimately into the patient so that they can reap the benefit of that. And so we think that the agreement that we have before us is a market improvement from last year's. It is paying a little bit more, but in return, you get faster time to improvement and approvals. And there is a pay for performance in there. So there is a little bit of extra in there that more money goes to the agency if we can even get these time to approvals down even lower. So I think there's an incentive for both the regulators and industry to go ahead and meet that ultimate goal, again, is to balance the public health with getting our products to market for patients and physicians faster. And I think it's a good deal for the industry, it's a good deal for the regulators, and ultimately it's a good deal, which is the most important thing, for the patient.
Yeah, and I mean it was a process. It does seem like it was a process getting to this deal in terms of just getting to an agreement that everybody could be happy with.
Yeah, it took longer than it should have, and a lot of that is COVID. But it's not entirely on COVID because, as I mentioned, there's other user fees that they were able to
Yeah.
their deadline. And I think, we learned some lessons, and I think there's probably some things that if we think through that we can make this process a little bit more efficient. But in the end, we got a deal, and Congress had its first hearing on it earlier this April. And I think I think it's on the right track. I think we will get it approved in time. Just under the wire, but certainly no one wants the alternative to not getting a deal. It was in everyone's interest to come to the table, and there's nothing like a deadline to kind of force that to happen. We're sort of in that position. Hopefully, in 5 years when we do this again, we'll do it much quicker, and I think that we will.
Okay. Well, and obviously one part of it is the dynamic. I mean, MIDA is just one part of the industry voice. Obviously, VADMED and MDMA as the other key ones in terms of the broader device industry. I mean, are those productive partnerships and relationships when you've just been at the table with them for this past year, but also obviously other issues where you're sort of during the pandemic where you've been some collaboration. What's the dynamic there in terms of those?
I think of sometimes it can be complicated because you have big companies and medium-sized companies and small companies, and we all don't have the same interest in some categories. Some are much more price sensitive than the others. But I can't think of a better way to do this. I think of all the ways to reach this negotiation and reach an agreement. I think this is the best way. It's just something that we need to work through and try to get more efficient on. But at the end of the day, we all came together and it worked. And I can't think of a better way to do it. It's just sometimes we don't always agree. We're a family of medical devices, but we don't always agree, and that's not to be unexpected. But at the end of the day, we did get it together, and everyone's comfortable with the agreement.
Okay. Yeah, be something interesting to watch. As obviously, like I say, this is now through Congress and to Congress, and hopefully, gets through on time. I mean, this is it seems like it's an important year in Congress in general for the industry because of user fees, but obviously then that provides a vehicle, as they say, for, all sorts of focus and area in FDA policy in general, medical device and elsewhere stuff. So, what are your priorities from that standpoint for 2022? Like, what are top issues that you're really focused on, other than obviously just getting this big MIDA thing passed?
Yeah, sure. And this is, once in a 5-year opportunity to do some real reforms within FDA. And, and a lot of that, a lot of trade associations see the MDUFA user fees package generally writ large as an opportunity to pass some reforms within the FDA vehicle. But for us, our top priorities remains to be service and remanufacturing. We're playing. Sometimes we have to play defense on that, but we're trying to be a little bit more offensive on that to emphasize patient care. Cybersecurity and artificial intelligence are the two other issues that are top priorities for MIDA. It seems like the one that might get a little bit of play, at least for this year, especially tied to the user fees, is working on remanufacturing. We've been working very closely with the agency on remanufacturing. And this is simply about patient care. Up to this point, we had focused primarily on service and bringing to attention the regulators some incidents that we have seen that would constitute remanufacturing, although at the time we didn't really think there was. We just thought it was improper servicing. But the goal here with service is to hold all servicers, no matter who you are, to the same quality, safety, and regulatory standards. And I think that when you think about the complexity of medical devices, some of our capital equipment, and some of them, many of them, emit radiation. It can be dangerous radiation. There's a human element, I think, to all of these things. First of all, when you go into the hospital and they're going to put you into this long tube, an MRI or CT or something like that, makes a lot of noise. It's scary kind of moment in your life too. You're trying to figure out what's wrong with you, kind of thing. And I think you go into that situation, you assume that the hospital, the physician, the nurses, everyone and everything in that facility meets the highest quality and safety standard. The radiologist who treats you, of course, is licensed. The nurses, the radiology technologist is as well. And you might see what you don't see, though, before you go into that long CT tube or that MRI, is what happened before you. The person that came before you might have been servicing the equipment, and you might assume that person also has to meet high quality and safety standards. And that would be true. You'd be correctly assume that when you're talking about the manufacturer, if the manufacturer is one servicing it. But that's not true if you're talking about a non-manufacturer, third-party servicer, that they don't have to register with the FDA. The FDA doesn't know who they are, and they're not held to the same quality and safety and regulatory requirements that the manufacturer is. And so you might be asking yourself, well, who are these people? Who are these firms that aren't under the same type of regulatory oversight? Well, in 2018, the FDA estimated that the total number of firms that are non-servicers that are working in this field are somewhere between 16,500 and 21,000. So it's a pretty wide number of people. And if you were just to divide that number equally amongst the states, that's about 400 of these different firms that people really don't know a whole lot about that are servicing this medical equipment. And so it's really trying to figure out who are these people servicing these firms. And of course, the consequences that we've seen with something that's improperly serviced, it puts the technicians and the patient at risk. It could cause serious injury. You could have a poor image if something is improperly serviced. It could put technicians, you could lead to a delayed diagnosis. We talked earlier about COVID, about a delayed diagnosis by not going. Well, if you go and the image isn't clear and you don't see it, it could be a misdiagnosis, or it could lead to another test that you have to have. And that, of course, increase healthcare costs. So we believe in increasing transparency and accountability in the third-party service industry is an important step to ensuring that safety, that patient safety. And so we've been asking Congress in the past, we've been asking the FDA to let's have everyone register with the FDA so we know who they are. let's have everyone have a quality management system as well, too, that they can adopt and maintain that to ensure the devices are returned back to their safety and effective condition. And let's make sure that we report adverse events so that we can know and try to deal with that in the future. And so that's what we've been asking on the service front. Now, I mentioned earlier about remanufacturing, and that's the issue that I think is starting to get some traction because, first of all, when you think about service is sort of a distant cousin to remanufacturing. You might go into, as a servicer, you might go into a situation to repair a device, and you might think that this is service, but then you could cross the line into remanufacturing. And remanufacturing is a FDA regulated activity, which the medical device could be altered in a way that there may be a risk that the device no longer functions. And it's really confusing, I think, right now, because we don't know exactly what those lines are. I think the FDA is trying very hard to develop a bright line as to where those lines are when you cross the road from service into remanufacturing. And in fact, FDA alerted this to us in 2017. Congress asked the FDA to report on service because we had raised these issues that were of concern to us. And the FDA responded in a report in 2018 and said, you know what, in fact, these examples that we've seen are not improper servicing. What they are is improper remanufacturing. And so but those examples have escaped oversight because the statute is not clear in what FDA has authority to do. And so the solution, of course, is, well, let's fix the statute. Let's clarify the statute. And so that's where the focus is right now. And we have an opportunity through MIDA to clarify that. The current statute, and to get into the weeds a little bit, the current statute says that it's remanufacturing if you change the safety or the performance. But if you were to broaden that a little bit to clarify to say it could significantly change the safety and performance, that opens it up a little bit more where the FDA can go in there. And if you remember back in the late 1990s, the IOM report with its famous "To Err is Human," they talked about these for medical errors. They talked about these never events that you should have. I like to call for remanufacturing these always events. Why don't we clarify in the statute what are always events that are always remanufacturing so that everyone knows that if you cross this line, you are crossing into remanufacturing. So an example that we would clarify in the statute would be the changing of the sterilization method, the changing of reprocessing instruction, the changing of the design or the physical configuration of the device would be remanufacturing, the changing of the parts or the changing of the software or bypassing the cybersecurity or the software, using non-conforming parts or anything like that. All of those things would automatically trigger a remanufacturing issue. We don't want to discourage people from uploading cybersecurity patches. We want to encourage that. But if you are bypassing the safeguards that the manufacturer put in there for cybersecurity, that's remanufacturing. So we can have a bright line to say what is remanufacturing and what is not remanufacturing so that everyone is operating off the same set of rules. The FDA has it from an enforcement mechanism, and those that are servicing, the manufacturers and third parties, everyone knows the rules of the road. And so we think that is encouraging, that the FDA would like to see that kind of change in the code. It would give them the authority to go in there and make sure and educate people. We don't want to put people in jail or anything like that. We want to make sure that everyone knows the rules. In fact, in the legislation that we introduced, it's I can't remember that. It's HR 7253 is what it is. The bill was introduced. It not only clarifies the statute, as I mentioned, but David, it also includes a public awareness campaign so that everyone knows exactly what they're getting themselves into. And, look, if it doesn't say that you can't do it, it just says that you have to register and you have to make sure that people know who you are and things like that. So we think that it's something that it clarifies this issue that I think has dogged the agency, patients, and providers for a number of years.
Right. And FDA, I know FDA has a pending, guidance they're working on to do this, to clarify. But the idea of, I guess, the legislation is to add more, basically statutory heft behind it, and also maybe some support for that sort of education and sort of putting the word out there. And that seems to be part of the issue here, right? Is that just like there's so many, keeping track of who's doing this and who's not doing this. Some of them may not even be aware what they need to do, and kind of making it more of a solidified structure for these types of practices. And
that's right. That's exactly right.
Okay. And that, like you say, that bill that you referenced is something that is, kind of seems like up in the circular of things that could get, latched on to the user fee. It seemed like,
We've talked to a number of members, and look, this is a compromise, and it's something that we want to make sure that everyone understands exactly what we're doing here. This is really about patient safety more than anything else. This is not about a competitive advantage. This is strictly about patient safety. And FDA had some really good comments about this at the last hearing about the importance and how important this would be to clarify the statute. We've talked to a number of people on Capitol Hill. We're happy to talk to anybody. I know that we do have a little bit of opposition, but I think if you read the bill, I think everyone could see how this is common sense approach to patient safety.
Right. Opposition being from sort of some in the servicing industry. Is that?
Yeah, some in the service industry. I think they had seen an old draft that had been circulated. I think we've addressed, though, a lot of concerns that I've seen. Some people will oppose just anything, but right. I think when you look at where we've come with the agency, where we've come with industry and others and patient groups, I think they see this as a common sense approach. And I'm hopeful that not just one or two organizations or a company can stop something like this, because it's so important to patient safety.
Thanks for listening so far. This interview will continue after this short message. Market Pathways is the #1 publication that covers the people, challenges, and opportunities impacting the global medical device regulatory, reimbursement, and policy spheres. MyStrategist.com is your digital home to access all of our coverage and read the latest issue of Market Pathways. Your support is valuable and makes us better. Please remember to leave a review and rate Market Pathways on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to listen.
The other topic and issue you mentioned, cybersecurity, is also something that, there's kind of like, there's some legislative action going on there. And there's also some, FDA, parallel FDA guidance action going on there. I think just today, as we're talking on April 7th, the FDA just put out its updated draft guidance on cybersecurity pre-market requirements. And I know that's something, as I said on the Hill, I think there's some attention there in terms of, what type of, expectations there are for companies in terms of ensuring cybersecurity, et cetera. So, how is MIDA looking at that issue? Is this how things are being addressed now kind of a reasonable approach? Is there key kind of gaps and concerns in how cybersecurity is being addressed, or is it just a matter of, kind of solidifying things? What's your overall sense of how things are going there?
Yeah, I think they're going in the right direction. And I think maybe the tipping point was really starting to get with the agency to start thinking about cybersecurity differently and building it into our products and our approval process. I think anything that was before, and that was 2014, about that time when the FDA came out with that pre-market guidance, which was extremely helpful to get us to start putting this stuff into these safety cybersecure mechanisms in our products. Anything before that, of course, is still connected, but it doesn't have those same considerations. I talked to one major hospital in Virginia the other day, and they told me that they were getting cyber attacked over 1,000 times a day. And you think about all the data security, the patient security, just the whole convenience of not locking down your emergency department for something like this. The problem that we're seeing is that the older connected imaging devices, we call them legacy devices. Some of them are 15 to 20 years old. They were contemplated before we had this guidance from the FDA, and they face a few challenges. One challenge is that the software components themselves, you think about your cell phone, for example, Apple's not updating certain products, older devices or software devices. Microsoft is sort of the same way. They no longer receive those updates. Secondly, what you've relied on sophisticated security controls. They require cyber experts to maintain those devices. Those aren't present in hospitals as well, too. And I think the third thing, as I mentioned, is just the design documentation can be imperfect. These devices that are older, they just weren't designed for these sophisticated attacks that we've seen. And we ran a study from our membership, but we also used some outside data to take a look at the legacy devices, just what's out there in the installed base that might be of particular concern, something that's maybe 15 years old or 20 years or older. And some of the results were a little bit surprising when you think about what the average life cycle is for a device. On X-ray, we found about 22% of all the X-rays out there are 20 years or older, and 39% are 15 years or older. For CT is more of a newer type technology. Only 1% is 20 years or older, but 14% are 15 years or older. For MRI, 4% are 20 years or older, and 19% are 15 years or older. And I can go on down the line for nuclear and PET and ultrasound, but they're similar type numbers. That there are a cohort, maybe it's somewhere between 10 and 15% of products that are 20 years or older. And the question really is what do you do about those? What do you do about those legacy devices that are still connected to the internet, but they were never made to withstand some of the sophisticated cyber attacks that we had? And one of the possible solutions are you could take that date, that 2014 date, as a sort of a benchmark to say anything built after 2014 is okay, but anything below that, we need to figure out a way. How do we move those off the market and either replace them, update them, or replace them with products that are more cyber secure? In 2017, the HHS had a cybersecurity task force, and they outlined a need for an incentive program, sort of like a cash for clunkers. You probably wouldn't want to call it that, but it's something like that, something that we can look into to say, how do we sort of target some of these older equipment? I mean, the alternative is to unplug it from the internet. And I'm not sure that people think that is, while that might solve an attack issue, that's probably not the best thing to do in terms of what we think of as a way to get your image quickly to another site, to another state, to another location, so that it can be acted on as quickly as it can. But I think that's the kind of thing that we're looking for. And we're in fact looking to introduce legislation as a carrot, not a stick, but as a carrot to incentivize providers for moving some of their older equipment, say pre-2014, for example, to move that off the installed base and bring in something that is more cyber secure, because it is about patient safety.
Right. And that's more of a sort of a market mechanism type incentive versus it's not really like a regulatory change that could impact, it's really a business decision to take those off, but there's a safety issue involved. So it's a matter of how to like thread that.
That's right. And I think every day this is on top of everyone's mind. I mean, you talk to the CEOs of hospitals, this is probably one of their top concerns is cybersecurity, and making sure that if there's a vulnerability, you have to move towards addressing that vulnerability. And we see this as a weak spot when it comes to cybersecurity. And you think about all the different implications when it comes to it's similar to the servicing issue, because if there's patches, we want to make sure that the proper patches are being out there and being deployed. But you can imagine that if some of the schematics get into the hands of malicious actors, for example, we have threats abroad that are constantly invading and plaguing us. We have to make sure that we have the proper tools and the cybersecurity to block those attacks from infiltrating, because it can be dangerous when it comes to removing a tumor that's not there, or putting a tumor in that shouldn't be there, or doing all kinds of different things that could mess with the radiation, that when it comes to treatment or when it comes to diagnosis can really have a detrimental impact on the patient. So cybersecurity is something that we take very seriously, and we need to figure out a way to make sure that every device that's in the installed base is as safe and secure as it possibly can be.
Right. So the biggest gap and concern there is with those older legacy devices, but presumably process for building in cybersecurity to do is always evolving, but there's the procedures in place and the oversight in place there is appropriate or as it can be. Okay.
Yeah, no, I believe so. I think we've worked very closely with the agency. We like the direction that certainly it's going in. I look forward to reviewing the guidance that just came out that you mentioned.
Right.
But this is one of our top issues for a reason. It's the kind of things that we have people that it keeps them up at night, and I know it's all about making sure that our patients are safe and secure in their diagnosis in our products.
Right. And now, and then kind of in the digital realm of the world here. I mean, on sort of digital health stuff, and I know artificial intelligence is such a. I mean, it seems like obviously all the sort of first tranche of things that have gone through FDA, let's say, have been more of a radiology focused or AI technology for triaging, diagnosing, et cetera. Is that, I mean, and so there's this is happening in real world. There's technology out there. It's going through. Is there some what's the priorities on that front in terms of the evolving elements of that technology and once it's on the market, et cetera, and what needs to be done there from MIDA's perspective?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is probably one of the biggest areas that we've seen in healthcare that has the potential to grow and have a lot of benefit for the patient. You talk about the quadruple aim in proving value when it comes to reimbursement. This thing checks all the boxes in spades. And you think about what it would do for the patient, what it would do for the practice. It will lower cost, better patient outcomes, all those things. But to your point, it is making sure it goes through this regulatory scheme as quickly as it possibly can, have a predictable model that the FDA can approve these devices. They're already doing a lot of these products are already approved, but there's more in the pipeline that are even better, stronger, more powerful. And then it's going over to the reimbursement side and to make sure that these products are reimbursable. I went to RSNA this past year for the first time in a couple of years, and happy to get back and do that. But see all the different artificial intelligence companies. There's more now than ever before. There's startups, but they understand that there's their business model that if they can get, and they freely advertise how their products are FDA approved, but they also know that they're not going to make a single sell unless it gets reimbursed by CMS and other private providers. So it's working with CMS, it's working with Congress to come up with a model that we can maybe incorporate in our value-based care model for physician practices, but also hospitals as well, taking full advantage of the value proposition that these very strong and very powerful technologies, innovative technologies, can have on the patient, can have on the practice, can have on healthcare in general, lowering costs. So I think it's a win-win for us to do it, but it's making sure that we get these regulatory and reimbursement schemes aligned so that we can get these really good products into the hands of providers for the patients.
Yeah, and I have definitely seen, CMS working through some of these issues. You could see in some of its rulemakings working through like how to address AI and then things like that. Is there any sort of key big, issue that needs to be like rested there in terms of getting, fixing the reimbursement in general situation, or is it just getting comfortable with these technologies? What's the biggest challenge on the reimbursement front? Because it does seem like there is still in that very early growing stage in terms of figuring out how to reimburse for these types of tools.
Yeah, I mean, I think CMS needs to, I don't want to speak for them, but I think they want to see more value proposition proven to them. And I think that we have the information to do that. FDA and CMS, they have different perspectives of things that they're looking for before they approve. And it's just getting CMS to the point where they can be comfortable with having these value propositions shown to them and proven to them. And I think once that happens, I think you're going to see this industry really start to take off. So that's why this is a big priority for MIDA, because so many of our companies are doing this. We have companies, that traditionally that are just in the medical imaging hardware space, but we have so many, and many of those companies are also into AI space as well too. But we have so many other companies that are coming on that they want to be part of an organization that is focused on this particular issue. They're just software-based companies, but they're focused just on this mission to go ahead and open up those floodgates for reimbursement. Because once that does happen, we can prove that value proposition. And it's doing it in the physician fee schedule. It's doing it in the HOPS, the hospital outpatient. It's making that prove that data exists. And once that happens, I think we could start moving this market relatively quickly.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to reimbursement more broadly, just in sort of the medical imaging space, are there any sort of key priorities or challenges right now outside of the AI, issue in particular? But there's obviously always, years of interesting, dynamics with Medicare and in terms of how to address utilization payments, things like that. But what are the things you're focusing on in that regard?
One of the things that we've seen over the years is that in the past, Medicare has used imaging as a pay for. And that has been concerning over the years. It's getting much, much better now. But I will say you do have to worry about some of the issues with Congress and how much spending, their deficit spending they're doing. If at some point they're going to go back and take a look at where they can cut. And Medicare is always a prime target. Imaging is always a target as well, too. But I think over the years, we have proven our value. We have proven that making sure that there's proper safeguards in place. And I think of appropriate use criteria, making sure that there's guidelines in place so that we know when's to use the right scan at the right time for the right patient. And once those things are employed, I think we're being much more judicious in seeing that medical imaging is an important part of healthcare. And it's a contributing part. It's not something that's a pay for, it's a thing that's necessary for better patient care. And I think we're starting to prove the value that imaging brings to that proposition. But it's always something that we certainly have to be aware of. It's always a proposition that we have to prove. The patient aspect, one of the things I didn't mention about MIDA is, in addition to our companies that we have over 60 companies that are MIDA members, medical imaging members, but we also have patients, tens of thousands of patients that have joined our effort because how they know how important it is, how value of imaging can save their lives. And everyone has a story in making sure that Congress and policymakers know the value and the importance that imaging brings to every patient's life. So I think it's making sure that we are front of mind and reminding policymakers of the importance and the value that we bring to healthcare.
Right. And so there's some defensive element there, but also the offense of doing the education in advance, but also being ready for looking for those pay fors and see.
Yeah, that's right. Whatever happens, but healthcare, it's such an exciting time. There's always something new. That's what I love about healthcare. But the issues that we've talked about today with its servicing and remanufacturing, artificial intelligence, and cybersecurity, there's great opportunities here to start making progress that ultimately lead to patient care, better patient care, and better patient outcomes. And I'm so pleased that MIDA has that mission that is trying to focus those areas for our patients and our providers, so our customers.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It sounds like there's a lot on the plate. To wrap up here, are you also an elected member of the Virginia Assembly? Is that?
I am. I am. It's sort of like a recovery. They say you should find a job that you would do for free, and I basically do. But this is sort of a side job that I do. That it's a part-time legislator. Thankfully. We're only in session about 45 days or so. And actually the virtual world has actually helped me because I can now be in 2 places or 3 places at one time. But yeah, it's a perspective I think that I have as a state legislator, as elected official. I know with sort of their thought process and how to decide whether you make some investments in things or you don't do something. And so it's I've had a long career, and I've sat on multiple sides of the table. I worked on Capitol Hill. I've also been a lobbyist and now as an elected official. So I guess I have a pretty unique perspective. Although you look at all those industries that, that they have those industries that you trust and things like that. And they have politicians are always score low and lobbyists score low as well, too. I'm a little bit better than a used car salesman, I suppose, but I don't want to make the used car salesman upset. But, I haven't been one of those. But I'm a lawyer, too. So that makes that's a triple win.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I only have to face only a mother could love.
No, but that's interesting. I was going to ask how when you have time to eat and sleep, but it sounds like you're able to make that work, and it maybe in some ways informs your thinking of how to vice in both directions in terms of how to do the job.
Yeah, it is helpful perspective.
Well, interesting. Well, Patrick, I really appreciate you giving me the time today and talking to sort of what MIDA is up to and sort of what we have to look for and key challenges. So, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, David. Let's talk again next year and see how we did.
Yep, or before that. Sounds good.
All right. Sounds great. Thanks, David. Have a good day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
And that was the interview. I hope you enjoyed it. For background, we have ongoing in-depth coverage of the Medufa 5 user fee deal in Market Pathways. One of our recent articles actually identified that remanufacturing reforms that Patrick was talking about as one of the more likely items to latch onto the user fee bill. Another one, actually, there's potential legislation out there that could join in with user fees that addresses device cybersecurity standards. So look out for what we wrote about there and a lot more on many topics at mystrategist.com. That's where you can find all of Market Pathways, articles, analysis, databases, and more. For now, thanks so much for listening.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. Your support is valuable and makes us better. Please remember to leave a review and rate Market Pathways on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to listen.